I'll be your chair for this round. I use data products. I'm going to turn myself into themselves, and then we'll start with you.
Hello everyone, my name is Peter.
Fantastic. So, in proposition, we have in Japan. You can kindly tell me your names, your speaking order, if you want to prefer pronouns, and also, we're all okay with like recording the room and all that. So.
Hi, my name is Ruka. I'll be the first speaker for Team Japan. Speaker pronouns and sense to me.
Sorry, can you repeat your name?
Ruka?
Hi, I'm Natsuki Mori. I'll be speaking third speaker with thanks for competition, and I am sense to.
Okay.
I'm Seiji speaking second, he him.
Alright. And who's doing the reply speak?
I'll be replying, so Seiji second will also speaker.
Alright. I can do the most of the
Hey everyone, Nora from the Netherlands. I'll be one of the panelists. Good luck.
Alright, thank you, Brock. Now, the same for the beginning of opposition, we have Tanzania.
My name is Ali, pronouns are he, him, and I'll be second speaker.
I'm Hussein, he, him, I'm first.
Muhammad speaking third, he, him.
Alright, and who's doing the reply?
Me, first speaker.
Fantastic. And if you're okay with the streaming,
Yeah.
great. Right, so I think we'll.
Paper balance.
Yeah, we're good with that. Thank you. So I think that's the basics, you know, like 8 minutes and 15 seconds, and 4 minutes and 15 seconds to reply. I encourage you to ask and give POI in your speeches, and of course enjoy this round. If you're in the panel, can help with the timer, and you have like big keyboards in similar clock.
I don't know if the basic or either. Okay, I can do it.
That'll be awesome. Thank you so much. So without further ado, we can ask the first speaker in the proposition to do this great debate. Right here.
Two pieces on framing. First, what does the status quo look like? Currently, the USD is used as a main medium of transaction with the Balboa pegged to the USD, and there is no central bank that can control the monetary policy. Second, what's our policy? First, we will create an independent central bank. Our model is similar to the Chilean model, which has largely been successful. We will search for central bank leadership, both locally and internationally, requiring previous central banking experience. A 2/3 majority of parliament will be required to appoint or remove members. All of this will ensure that the bank is politically independent. Lastly, we will establish internal audit units. They will review decisions as well as publish monthly minutes and quarterly reports to annual IMF reviews. This will create transparency, accountability, and credibility. Second, we will keep the Balboa as the official currency and phase out the peg to the dollar over 5 years. Initially, we will keep it fluctuating only up to 2% against the dollar. Each quarter, we widen this fluctuation band by 1%, giving markets time to adjust. After year 5, the value of the Balboa will fluctuate freely. Third, we phase out the legal tender of the dollar in those 5 years. Initially, it will continue alongside the Balboa while we require all government transactions to be made in the Balboa, giving people time to get used to new currency and learn to trust it. After year 5, the dollar will lose its legal tender, but dollar accounts will remain legal for international trade. During those 5 years, the government will build up its foreign reserves to equal 100% of money in circulation. This allows Panama to sell US dollars and buy Balboas to stabilize the currency, effectively increasing demand. Moving on then to our first argument about economic growth led by increased international revenue. First on why the USD rate is so high. The dollar is used by many as the world's reserve currency. Countries around the world hold literally trillions in US dollar reserves, increasing demand and its value. Second, why it harms the flow of foreign money into Panama. A strong USD makes Panamanian exports more expensive, hurting its competitiveness against countries with lower currencies such as Mexico or Vietnam. It also disencourages foreign investment and tourism as businesses face higher costs. Third, on why foreign influx of money is crucial for growth. Exports make half of Panama's overall economy. Tourism and services account for 80% of its GDP. Increasing those will dramatically increase revenue. Crucially, Panama is an ideal place for investors. Its canal access reduces transportation costs drastically. It has a high rate of unemployment population that makes cheap labor potential, and with the US trying to divert its imports from China, it is looking for new locations for manufacturing. The only reason Panama's economy has been stagnant so far is the overpriced currency, making them lose to competitors. The implication is that our policy doesn't only help sell existing exports, but attract MNCs to create new ones, kicking forward the manufacturing industry that is only 5% of the economy right now. Finally, on the impacts. Firstly, growth translates into increased revenue from tax collection. This allows the public sector to grow and provide people with better welfare, education, and policing. It allows the government to pay its crippling debt. It creates a fiscal solution for economic crisis. Secondly, it diversifies the economy. This diversification is crucial. It makes Panama more self-sufficient and less reliant on imports in the long run, thus making it less vulnerable to tariffs and economic pressure from the US. It prevents economic shocks that impact one industry to drag down the entire economy. It creates more diverse job options, with manufacturing jobs being more accessible to the poor and uneducated. It creates a virtuous cycle. Revenue from manufacturing exports can be reinvested into machinery and R&D that improves manufacturing productivity and creates even more growth. You can't improve the productivity of services with technology, so on off, there's a ceiling to growth. Moving on then to our second argument about crises. First, we think that the control of monetary policy is crucial for response to economic crisis. During COVID, Panama's debt increased from 40% of GDP to 63%, and its economy shrank 18%. This is nearly double of what other countries with monetary policy experience, all because Panama only had fiscal tools. So why is that bad? Firstly, legislative processes to decide fiscal policies were too slow. A bill needs to be written, open for public comments, debated in parliament, amended, and voted on. This process takes months. This means at best, the crisis drags longer. At worst, by the time you pass a bill, it is too late to solve it. On our side, the central bank can respond promptly with monetary stimulus like lowering interest rates. Secondly, fiscal solutions accumulate debt. When your only way to create stimulus is to increase spending in a time when there is less productivity and revenue, your only option is to borrow money. With monetary independence, you can create stimulus without a debt crisis via interest rate reforms, money creation, or quantitative easing. Thirdly, fiscal solutions are too politicized. Because fiscal solutions need to be passed in parliament, political incentives bias them. This looks like adoption of irresponsible and populistic solutions. This means no solutions to inflation and crisis, as fiscally pulling the market can only happen through cutting government spending, which is extremely unpopular. On our side, the politically independent central bank can design a responsible solution that will reduce the public pressure on government. Second, on why the Fed won't save Panama. Firstly, the Fed will only resolve an economic crisis that hits the US directly. An economic crisis in Panama doesn't always mean an economic crisis in the US. Since the US has a much more diverse and wealthy economy, they're less likely to be hit with concerning crises. Secondly, even when a crisis does hit both countries, the Fed will intervene in ways that only benefit the US, not Panama. Firstly, because American interests favor prioritizing price stability at the expense of growth and unemployment. The American economy is high-tech and refinement-based. It buys raw materials and then refines them into high-quality products, which means that when prices increase, it doesn't only increase American cost of living, but also cost of production, resulting in business collapse and job loss. In contrast, more developing economies are not as vulnerable to price increases. They are much more vulnerable to stagnation, as it makes them struggle to keep their underdeveloped industries afloat. This is why in the current economic crisis, the Fed has been very reluctant to reduce interest rates, while in countries like India, the central bank has already lowered interest rates several times. Panama's economy is much more similar to India's than the US, yet its response to crisis is tied to the Fed. Secondly, the Fed also tailored its policy to correspond with Congress fiscal policy, not with Panama's. So when Congress issues large stimulus packages like during COVID, the Fed is less likely to cut interest rates because recession risks decrease and excess stimulus could cause inflation. But the US fiscal stimulus packages don't go to Panamanians, so the recession crisis persists. Finally, on how the harms of crisis get even worse as a result. When crisis drags on, businesses close, people lose jobs, etc. Delayed aid cannot undo permanent damage. You cannot reconstruct a business that shut down with a stimulus package that arrived too late. You cannot rehome a poor person who couldn't pay their mortgage with an aid package that arrived too late. Crisis dragging longer. People who lost jobs in the initial shock spend less and therefore money circulation lowers further. Investors pull out when they see no response to the crisis and expect it to last. Even after the crisis, you suffer long-term consequences that you have to pay for years and years with interest. The heightened risk of crisis deters investment and increases interest rate on loans. Even default is not an impossible outcome. It literally happened to Ecuador, already due to precisely a debt crisis resulting from dollarization. Today, we reclaim what 120 years of dollar dependence stole, the economic prosperity of Panama. Thank you.
The very importance of the asking the device. Now, first up, when we're ready, we can meet.
This level of viability is alright?
Yes.
Okay, 3, 2. Panama chose the dollar, and it's worked. Stability, investment, and crisis protection have all come from this choice. Switching to a local currency invites nothing but disaster. Our stance is that the government has a moral and legal obligation to act in the best interests of its people. Our side protects their interests by ensuring a more stable economy and political certainty. A couple of things from my speech. First, on framing, then on argumentation, from which was the case division would be, firstly on better economic stability, then on emergency relief, and then on better monetary policy. So let's start with framing, and let's start with what they give you. They talk about the status quo, about the US is the main medium of I agree. They talk about that they have previous central bank members, 2/3 of the parliament need to approve, and an internal audit. They claim that this would prevent any discrepancies in the parliament, which I think is fairly untrue because of the fact that corruption is so top down. Corruption is so top down. For example, in 2015, their president was actually jailed for embezzlement. Because of the fact that corruption is so top down, even if you have 2/3 of parliament, you will be unable to have the level of independence that the US Fed has, which will be explained in the monetary policy argument for my second speaker. Moving on to what else they say. In their model, they talk about they're going to peg to the US dollar over time. First of all, this is directly against the motion. You can't peg to another currency because it's by definition, a peg is independent. So if you can do whatever model you want, you cannot peg it because peg is what's happening right now. So you need to make it an independent currency. So peg, no, get rid of that. On to our points of framing. We have 3 points of framing. First thing is that the US dollar is the global reserve currency, and we'll say that I think we're mostly in agreement on this. I have 3 main reasons. We have global dependence, everyone depends on the dollar. We have 2 real world strength, the dollar is really strong and dominates other currencies. And 3, the USD is behind every other currency in the world, whether you like it or not. And 4 is historical precedent. The dollar has gone through ups and downs and has always come back. So I think we can agree that the USD is the backbone of global finance. I don't think there's much dispute here. Second point of framing is what Panama looks like in the status quo. Here, I think we have a lot of disagreements. So Panama looks like 4 things in the status quo. One is Panama is a high-income country, one of 2 high-income countries in the Latin America region. The other one is Mexico, which is also dollarized, significantly outperforming its neighbors. 2 is it is service-based, which they focus on offshore banking, tourism, and the Panama Canal. 3 is Panama has a special relationship with the US because 40% of the trade passes through the canal. And 4 is a small country, both geographically and population. This characterization actually rebuts their argument on diversity and diversifying the economy and exports. and I'll show you why. So what do they tell you on their side? They tell you that why strong currency harms Panama? Because Panamanian exports become more expensive, and Panama wants to manufacture goods. Let me tell you why this doesn't work. So, first of all, 3 responses. 1, Panama's economy is service-based, relying on tourism and Panama Canal. Devaluing the currency really hurts their main sectors are hurt by devaluing the currency. Secondly is, it's a very small economy, both population and geographically wise, which means the raw material access they have is really small, even with a weaker currency. Panama would not be able to be a manufacturing-based economy. They paint it as if Panama is going to grow into this manufacturing powerhouse like China, which is simply untrue. There's no way they'll transition to a manufacturing economy while maintaining its high income status, and obviously that's a bad thing if you lose that. And then 3, even if our goal as Panama was to have a better manufacturing sector, which is not, even if it was, yeah, you need FDIs and investment in order to diversify those sectors.
Why?
Which I will show you in my first substantive as to why we lose FDIs and investor confidence. So that removes the diversity thing. Moving, and the third point of framing is a burden that I would like to push on side proposition, which I failed to do. When you introduce a new currency, you need to show that the public will trust that new currency. Because if you introduce a new currency and it's not used by the citizens, then it's pointless. You have to prove that the public would trust their new currency instead of just hoarding the US dollar and ignoring it completely. Proposition has the fiat to introduce a new currency, they do not have the fiat to say everyone is going to be forced to use it. Moving on to argumentation then. Okay.
So if your characterization is that Panama has a small economy, that only breeds into our analysis of how the US won't care about the Panama economy, thereby increasing the necessity of an independent monetary policy.
I'll address that when I talk about emergency relief. So, starting my first substantive on better economic stability. The thesis of this argument is that Panama's use of the US dollar is superior for economic growth and stability. Panama's unique success in the region can be attributed directly to the US dollar. Why is the US dollar better for Panama? 3 reasons. First is ultra-low inflation and built-in stability. Panama's inflation rate is just 0.7%, among the lowest in Latin America. The USD is a globally stable currency, not subject to rapid devaluation. Crucially, Panama cannot simply print more money, which imposes automatic fiscal discipline. This matters because inflation is a direct harm to the working class, eroding wages, savings, and purchasing power. Stable prices are what protects real income. 2 is high investor confidence and economic growth. The dollar is a trusted global currency. That trust extends to Panama, which has attracted FDI worth nearly 80% of its GDP. Investors know that the dollar is a safe bet, giving them larger incentive to invest, as they don't face risks from currency fluctuations, inflation, and economic crisis. So they say that FDIs are less likely in their argument because of high prices. I think it's a lot more likely that capital flight occurs when I see a transition, because it's a very volatile moment when they're transitioning, and when they transition, I see it's a new currency, not trusted by anyone. I, as an investor, will now want to pull out, instead of an economy which uses the US dollar, which is globally trusted, which I think they pretty much would agree with. And 3, easier and cheaper trade. Panama imports most of its goods, because I told you, it's not a manufacturing hub. From food to electronics, because it uses the US dollar, it can pay for imports directly. A local currency would require first exchange local money for the USD. If demand for new currency is low, the exchange rate would be unfavorable, making imports more expensive. These extra costs are passed on to consumers as higher prices. Using the US dollar removes this inefficiency, keeping prices stable and essential goods affordable, which is very good for the working class if you ask me.
Point.
Why a new currency would be dangerous? 3 reasons. 1 is investor flight with expensive debt. A national currency with no track record won't inspire global trust. Investors would pull out or demand massive risk premiums. This will be important when I talk about emergency relief. 2 is inflation risk for small economies. Countries like Venezuela and Argentina fail to manage their own currencies, resulting in hyperinflation and eventual dollarization. Panama lacks the monetary infrastructure to avoid a similar outcome. A new currency, even if they try and maintain stability, will never match the dollar stability. 3 is costlier trade and inflation spiral. Panama will still need the US dollars to import. Without sufficient reserves, it would resort to printing money, causing devaluation. This pushes import costs higher, which drives inflation, weakens the currency even more, and it's a continuous spiral. And once that spiral begins, it's nearly impossible to stop. Impacts, these are pretty intuitive. With a new currency, we get hyperinflation and lose the stability that we have in the status quo. We lose investor confidence and thus FDIs as a bonus, and we screw over the working class by decreasing their purchasing power with a new currency. Secondly, on the idea of crisis relief. There are 2 types of crisis relief. There are one which affects both Panama and US, in which case, we face the same problem. They claim that, no, it's different, but really, because we have the same currency and a very linked economy because 40% of the trade goes through the Panama Canal, we have the same response. Either we need a stronger currency, in which case we raise or lower interest rates, or we need a weaker currency, in which case we raise or lower interest rates, depending on what we need. So that's out of the way. Secondly, the thing they brought up is a crisis unique to Panama. So there are a couple of reasons why we need short-term relief over that. So we need to have more investor confidence so we get cheap loans. In their case, we don't get cheap loans, we are more likely to get that. And two, we can't panic print money, which leads to hyperinflation. In their case, they can just panic print money, which they're so keen on, which completely screwed over Zimbabwe's economy. And you can see that. In our case, we prevented economic crisis and we handled it so much better. Definitely proud of it.
While Panama may appear rich, when you look underneath some of these shining heading statistics, you uncover a system of economic apartheid. It is shackled by its use of the US dollar to prevent it from diversifying, enriching a small elite while ensuring that the country remains one of the most unequal in the world. Its links to the dollars means that it lacks monetary independence to protect citizens from recurring crises and leaves it at risk of a crippling financial crisis. Two simple questions. First, I'm going to deal with growth, and second, on stability, and possibly extending third argument later in my speech. Firstly, on growth. The main mechanism the main line of mechanism we get from their bench is about increased import costs. We would argue two things in response. One, we're going to argue that we would prioritize exports over imports, and second, I would argue that the increase in import costs will be marginal at best. Firstly, why wouldn't we argue the prioritization of exports is important? A few mechanisms. One, the increase in revenue is higher than the increase in cost because of the way manufacturing works. You buy cheaper raw material, refine them, and then sell expensive refined products. The final product to export is just much more expensive than the materials imported for, so the currency rate markup, which is the same for both, pays you more than it costs. Second, exports increase income and imports increase the cost of living. Those cancel out. What doesn't cancel out is growth, which is the only lever that can make wages outdo prices by increasing productivity in the economy. This is only enabled through exports. Third, on job creation, which is enabled only through exports, which is logically prior to the affordability of any imported goods. If goods are cheap but people are unemployed, they still can't afford them. Fourth, because expensive imports are at worst a short-term problem, because when market growth and diversification manifest, we will have more local production self-sufficiency, import reliance will then solve itself over time, stagnation cannot. Fifth, Panama is surrounded by a lot of cheap exporters, as these make the majority of Latin American countries. It is not short for cheap import options, it is much more threatened by export competition. Furthermore, I would argue that there is a bunch of mitigatory mechanisms against expensive imports. First and most importantly, the vast majority of Panama's imports are just not necessities. The country is largely self-reliant on food, producing enough heat, fruits, and other stuff. Basic goods are only around 1.8% of all of Panama's imports. Import prices then don't impact the cost of living as much as they impact the cost of luxuries for the well-fed elites. Second, many products that Panama imports could be produced domestically. Guatemala, for instance, has seen its electronic manufacturing sector growing dramatically. The core difference between Panama and Guatemala is not population size or skill, but that the overvalued dollars means that it is far too cheap to import these goods, and there is no incentive to develop these sectors internally, nor for foreign investors to use Panama as a base to export from. Thirdly, companies use a different pricing system, accounting for different purchasing power in different countries. This means as prices of imports in USD become unaffordable with Balboa, by laws of supply and demand, companies will adjust prices down accordingly. This is why, for example, a Big Mac costs less in India than it does in the US. This largely deals with then the third mechanism in the first argument about import costs. Crucially, I would also argue there are two responses against our first argument proving growth are insufficient. Their first response argues that due to the service-based nature of the economy, the devaluation harms the current industry. I would just ask them to explain how this happens. Clearly, an increase in economic growth and the USD and the currency devaluation doesn't impact the cost of internal services in Panama. Furthermore, I would argue that diversification just tends to be a more important impact in this debate. The Panama Canal offers great short-term opportunities, but if not exploited for more domestic growth than it is now, it is not a sustainable source of revenue in the long term. For example, alternatives to the Panama Canal in the northwest shipping passage to the Arctic, which has only become viable in the last few years due to the polar ice caps melting, or in the last year itself, the number of ships passing through the Arctic Ocean and the Bering Sea has tripled compared to previous years. There's a lot of other proposals, for example, about Nicaragua and a canal there as well. All of this means that the Panama Canal is losing and will continue to lose its competitive advantage. It is lethal for the future of the economy without diversification. If we don't take advantage of our opportunity to attract businesses or to manufacture domestically in Panama, and we hedge our risks against this by replacing canal revenues over time with revenues from manufacturing exports and creating domestic growth less reliant on international trade, Panama is doomed for failure. Their second response against our line of argumentation argues that there is low raw material in Panama, which means we can't manufacture. Why then do we argue diversification is possible? On an intuitive basis, you don't need natural resources or a giant population to create a manufacturing sector. Look at Taiwan or Singapore. Both have few resources and a small population, yet a strong manufacturing hub. Panama is strategically located. If you set up a company in Panama, you are close to the canals and a shipping lane. This keeps transport costs low. That is a huge advantage. The US is trying to cut or reduce Chinese manufacturing, and Panama is among the best placed countries to benefit. It is not far from the US as Vietnam. It has untapped labor markets, etc. But all of this, and the weaker currency means exporting is easier as well. All of this means it's fairly possible for diversification to occur. All of this proves the first clash on growth. Second clash, on crises then. Their first argument argues, and there are two mechanisms under this, argues low inflation and stability occurs as a result of the USD, and also investor confidence occurs. In response to this, I'm going to prove largely a few things. Firstly, I'm just going to prove that the central bank will be done well. Crucially, this will then mitigate against the vast majority of their analysis that argues, for example, elements like corruption or mismanagement of finances. Firstly, a lot of our model already mitigates the risk of corruptibility as it prevents the government from doing things like impacting board members without a broad consensus, etc. Second, other institutions can hold the central bank accountable. For example, the IMF will hold the central bank accountable, or also the strong financial sector in Panama, including operations by banks like JP Morgan, also have incentive to pressure the government to avoid meddling in the central bank. Thirdly, corrupt governments are stupid, and no meddling with the voters bank. And knows meddling with the central bank risks rapid inflation and demotion for the credit score, which voters will punish them for. Crucially, these voters know of these crises. Look, they know Argentina, for example, and therefore have high incentive to hold the government accountable in here. Yeah, go ahead.
What incentive does JP Morgan, a private equity firm, have in Panama's central bank?
They literally operate in the country. If the currency in that country is screwed, then obviously they're also screwed. The second thing I would like to do in response to the first argument, though, is also just prove the stability of the currency. Panel, there are 4 reasons as to why the currency will be stable. 1, for the vast majority of their harms to materialize, they don't just need to prove devaluation, which we concede and welcome, but uncontrollable rapid devaluation. This is unlikely for all of the obvious reasons, like central bank intervention happening. Secondly, we obviously preempted a lot of this from frame. For example, our foreign reserves enable fast response, and despite what they're claiming, it's within our fiat to argue that we will slowly reduce the peg. Thirdly, Panama has a good track record of financial responsibility. Like after COVID, it maintained fairly low debt, established a sovereign wealth fund, etc. And fourthly, in the immediate term, like 6% of the global trade goes through the Panama Canal. It's a lot of transactions in the Balboa, contributing both to its stability and investor trust. Furthermore, Panama's importance also means that international actors have incentive to help ensure a smooth transition and avoid monetary crises, which means, for example, institutions like the IMF or nations have also incentive to help out here. All of this then responds to their line of argumentation on investor confidence and stability. Finally, I also just want to quickly deal with their absurd assertion that like the US, that economic crises can be solved in their world. Clearly, even if the US and Panama are both impacted by a crisis, we proved from our second argument that the method by which they would like to deal with the crisis is different, which is why their second responses don't work either.
To the top, and then you can be bigger.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panama. If you've been in Panama for a while, it's likely that you've come across this coin. This coin is the Panamanian Balboa, and it's the coin system that Panama uses as a medium of exchange. If you notice on the Panamanian Balboa, there's a picture of a man called Vasco de Nunes Balboa, and he was a Spanish conquistador who came to Panama in the 1600s to take over towns, pillage people, rape women, and kill children. Yet, Panama uses him as the face of the Panamanian Balboa. Why? Because their independent identity isn't held within the single symbolic gesture. Their independence is held within the strategic choice they made in 1904 to pivot towards the US dollar because it posed strategic advantage to them in 1904 and still does because not much has changed with Panama. Inside the position's ideal world of whether Panama can actually pivot to an export-based economy doesn't exist because it's a dystopian dream that wouldn't exist in a real-life scenario. Let's start with framework. Firstly, they claim to have an independent central bank, or that they wish to exert an independent central bank. We tell you that this is not possible as of status quo. Even if they do have the fiat, it's likely to fall in the future because Panama lacks the infrastructure to actually uphold a central bank. So given that they do have the fiat to actually impose a central bank, we don't think it would run very well and stable in the long term. More on framework. They talk about local and international members of the bank that would actually run the bank. So now we're going to invite people from other countries with different incentives to actually run a country that we actually wish to operate and benefit of Panama. So that's an inherent contradiction on their side in terms of framework. They also talk about a 2/3 parliamentary bank majority to actually impose any decisions. We tell you that this is also unrealistic because they want Parliament to be taking part in everyday central bank decisions, which is just unlikely and doesn't happen with most countries. And they also talk, it's also hypocritical considering they want a fast system, yet they want Parliament to sit down every time the central bank has to make a decision regarding monetary policy and fiscal policy. It's not possible to have a fast system, yet always have to convince 2/3 of Parliament to agree upon a monetary or fiscal decision. They also talk about this idea of a 1 to 2% float, which is essentially a very fake way to say they're going to peg to the US dollar, which again doesn't fulfill the requirements of the motion. The motion asks them to have an independent currency. Even if they would to remove this peg after 5 years, we think it would fall apart because again, Panama doesn't have the infrastructure to support it, and Panama, as of today, is faced with very unfortunate circumstances of a largely corrupt government. Moving on to Prop 1. They talk about stronger USD hurting exports. The thing is, Panama isn't export-based. We've told you that. They've told you that. Panama is mostly service-based and mostly transport-based. They have the Panama Canal, and that's the largest single individual contributor to their economy. So their idea to pivot to an export-based economy, I'll get to on later. But as of now, it's not true that Panama is export-based. Secondly, they talk about investors in the Panama Canal, and they want to use the Panama Canal as leverage, as they say, because it's very strategic asset. We actually agree with that. We think that currently the Panama Canal is a very strategic asset, and in the future will continue to be a strategic asset, which is why we don't think we should risk that strategic asset by switching to a flimsy currency and trying to risk our strategic asset, the Panama Canal. We don't think that's a good move because people actually, the US, 40% of US trade actually passes through the Panama Canal, and we don't think that there's going to be very positive US backlash once we switch currencies. We've seen in the past, in the past few weeks with the US invading Iran for small incentives. We think that switching currencies is a direct indicator to the US to say, hey, come take the canal that you literally built for us, because now we have incentive to use that as leverage against you. So we don't think the US is going to respond to that very positively. They also say that they're going to create more jobs because of a manufacturing and export-based economy. This again is an inherent contradiction because they want to reduce imports and they say that they want less imports. And they also agree to the point my first speaker made when he said that Panama currently doesn't have the natural resources to support an export-based economy. So they would actually have to import the raw materials, which would again increase the import-based economy. So that's an inherent contradiction on their side and shouldn't be taken into consideration with this motion. Firstly, next they also talk about control and monetary policy is important for crisis management. We tell you this is a blatant lie because for 100 years, Panama has been able to manage crisis with its fiscal policy. In the 2008 global recession, Panama did significantly better than any other Latin American country. In fact, the next year they came in with a 7% GDP growth, something no other Latin American country has seen, and we attribute that to the US dollar. We don't think that that would have been possible with this new flimsy currency that they instead proposed. Moving on, they also talk about fiscal solutions accumulating debt. This again is not true again because fiscal policy is just a lever for the government to control spending and taxes. So the government's been doing this for a long time, for 100 years, since 1904. It's worked perfectly. We don't see incentive to change this. We don't see the need to change this. If they can show to us where Panama has actually done bad in a crisis, where people have been left starving, where people have been left homeless, then we agree that there's incentive for a change. But Panama's been doing fine. Why do we have to idealize this version of monetary policy? Because Panama's doing fine without it. And Panama's seen a 6% average GDP growth. And we think that the little growth that they would see on their side isn't enough incentive for us to take this risky maneuver. Moving on to a substantive truth. Firstly, the premise of this argument being we have better monetary policy on our side. Firstly, because Panama's use of the US dollar isn't about economy and convenience. It's also about wisely avoiding the risks of managing monetary policy at home. Unlike fiscal decisions, which are visible and accountable, monetary decisions are technical, opaque, and highly vulnerable to abuse, which again is very likely in Panama because Panama is severely corrupt and they haven't shown us how they're actually going to deal with the corrupt nature of Panama itself. The only thing that they've said is they're going to bring people from outside to work in these banks, which again we think is contradictory because they're going to have their own incentives. And then we have the U.S. monetary policies being better for Panama is because we have the U.S. Fed, the strongest monetary institution in the world, is doing our work for us. Why change that? Why risk it? That's what we push for on our side. We also talk about proven crisis management. The Fed has successfully helped Panama navigate through COVID-19, through the 2008 depression. We haven't heard any examples from their side of the house, which is why we think this argument should be disregarded on their side of the house. We also talk about why independent monetary policy would be actively dangerous. 2 points on this. Firstly, exclusive harms. Corruption in monetary policy is hidden and devastating. So unlike fiscal policy, actually, where you can track budgets, investigate spending, and hold politicians accountable, that's not possible with monetary policy. A government can't track which politicians are putting pressure on which banker to actually print more money and cause inflation to fill their own pockets. This is possible with fiscal policy. Panama's been doing it for 100 years. Every other example of a Latin American country that's tried to implement this has failed. We've given you examples like El Salvador, we've told you about Argentina, we've told you about Mexico. All these countries that are actually trying to impose things like this have failed because they don't have the infrastructure to support it. Moving on, we also talk about no infrastructure or expertise. Panama has never had to manage a full monetary system. It lacks a credible independent central bank. It lacks deep reserves to stabilize its currency, and it also has global trust in its economic prince. Building all this from scratch would take decades if it ever succeeds at all. Yet, why is this about monetary policy and not fiscal policy? Some might say that Panama handles fiscal policy like taxes and spending and it hasn't collapsed, but that's exactly the point. Fiscal policy is more accountable, as I mentioned before. Moving on to the impact, being what's at stake. Panama has remained stable while its neighbors like Nicaragua and Venezuela suffered economic collapse. That's not an accident. It's because Panama took one of the most dangerous levers of power, monetary control, out of local hands and gave it to a system that works, creating national currency that reverses that. So moving on to substantive 3, which is stability and adaptation means resilience in crisis. Now we've heard a lot about stability and resilience in crisis from side proposition, but we think that's the most blatant lie that's been told in today's debate, because if anything to do with crisis, it simply just lies on our side of the house. Panama has independent dollar generation from the canal, and it's 80% service-based economy that they actually accept. So Panama organically earns the US dollar. So the thesis of this being that we don't care that they think that with a new independent currency, Panama would actually be able to adapt to crisis more. We tell you that this is not possible at all because this new currency will be flimsy because of reasons we've mentioned. We tell you the US dollar is the global reserve. We tell you that Panama earns the US dollar organically. And we tell you that's the best way to manage crisis because it has those reserves.
Well, that's figure for FINC, where we manage each one is a QI. Now we can call third part.
Three major themes in this speech. First, on implementation of this policy. Second, on economic growth. Lastly, on stability. Before any of those themes go, I just want to first clarify and deal with their claim how U.S. will retaliate this in a bad way. First, it is completely absurd to just, consider this in a good way, insofar as I think the current Trump administration, the current U.S. government, has so many myriads of things that they're currently carrying out. It's unclear to me why, precisely for their logic of Panama being small, they would likely to just do it in a bad way without clear law. But it is completely speculative to also assert that the current administration will even care about de-dollarization in the first place. Firstly, because I think when Argentina implemented a similar policy, I think the US was quite negligent in this policy to begin with. Secondly, because I think the current US administration speaks of the self-reliance of other states rather than free riding off of the US, meaning that it's presumably going to be reacting in a much more positive way than they would characterize insofar as this breeds into a more self-reliant policy. Third of all, I think the current administration just rather hates the current Fed management. Therefore, I think this breeds into this current justification as to why the Fed is going back. But even if you don't take this panel, even if all of your reasons are true, this isn't the tipping point. Because if you look at the status quo, the current Trump administration has already asserted to take the control militarily of the Panama Canal, and it's unclear to me why this one specific policy is going to be a tipping point for their case to stand this debate. First things first, let's chat about the implementation of this policy. I think their one-line response would be that, there's a corruption in the status quo, and that this is likely to result in a bad way in central bank. There are two ways in which I want to deal with this claim. First, in terms of the policy, I want to note all of our policies just effectively mitigated your claim. Even if the government is in fact corrupt, all of our arguments are how things like external checks and balances existing, we're able to prove to you why this corruption wouldn't manifest in a bad way. But even if you don't think that much, I'll still engage for the sake of sports. Firstly, even if those governments are corrupt, we've provided you selfish incentives of the current government to just have the economy that is just much more stable on our side of the house. We talked about how central bankers too have a reputational incentive to care about the people on the ground. And notably, as per their own mechanism in how stability is important, people are likely to hold these individuals accountable. You just literally don't want Zimbabwe's hyperinflation to happen in the first place. Secondly, because corrupt governments aren't stupid, meddling in the central bank risks rapid inflation, which will obviously affect their money that they have in their pocket, which is a reason why I think you have selfish incentive as well. But even if you don't take that panel, we've already proven to you why international actors such as the IMF and JP Morgan will hold you accountable. Their first response is that international technocrats have no incentive in Panama. One, I think IMF obviously does, because in the UN, the literal mandate of the IMF to care about the stability of the developing country. But secondly, in terms of the JP Morgan and international institutions, they too have an incentive to do so, insofar as they have businesses operating within Panama, and in instances where the currency volatility, they would as per their own mechanism, you obviously wouldn't want that, right? Which is a reason why we would like to hold these governments accountable on our side of the house. But even if you don't take that, and even if we buy into the fact that Panama is corrupt, that isn't becoming a reason why central bank will be corrupt. Because this assumes the most basic version of corruption and does not realize country can be corrupt in some ways, but not in others. The US is in fact corrupt, if you think about it, in the level of insider trade within the Congress. But that does not follow that Fed is corrupt, which is the reason why our current policy specifically ensures the incorruptibility of central bank, which is the reason why you just cannot just throw away a lot of reasons as to why corruption just take this debate already. The final thing I want to deal with it under this implementation claim is your idea that you have to get 2/3 parliament approval every time. No, that wasn't our policy. Our policy was to only appoint and remove members and get consensus within it. But literally, it's not about every single policy that's just out of the debate. First things first, let's chat about economic growth. I want to note strategically, this was a very charitable argument to begin with. Because we say devaluation in its currency is a consensus in the debate. It is their reason as to why you get more imports that are expensive. It is our reason as to why you get more cheaper exports. And here's when Seiji's analysis we realize is particularly important. Because what we told you from Seiji's speech was that in instances where Panama is currently relying on a certain sector, it is critical for Panama to just diversify its economy. It is critical for Panama to increase its revenue through the exports. And here is how the lack of response is valid for them. They never give you extreme, direct, weighing mechanisms as to why you want to prioritize imports over the other. The final thing I want to point out is that they just mischaracterize what the status quo of Panama looks like. Because what we have pointed out is that even though Panama Canal is giving you sufficient amount of revenue in status quo, you cannot rely on them in the future. Which is the reason why you must diversify the economy, which is the reason why you must access cheaper exports in order to just grow its jobs, in order to grow the manufacturing sector that is currently unreliable. Then they say diversification is impossible. Three responses. One, on an intuitive level, you do not need natural resources or a giant population to create a manufacturing sector. Look at Taiwan, look at Singapore. Both have few resources and a small population, yet a strong manufacturing sector. Secondly, Panama is strategically located. If you set up a company in Panama, you're close to channels in the shipping lane. That keeps transport costs low, and there's a huge advantage that you use on our side of the house. Third of all, the US is trying to cut or reduce Chinese manufacturing and supply chains. Panama is one of the best places countries to benefit, which is the reason why I think it is likely to have the capacity to diversify on our side of the house. Before I move on to exchange rebuttals of the way.
We study Singapore as a fair or unfair comparison because of their strong economy.
Okay, but we're giving you mechanistic reasons, and furthermore, I don't think this is an example of it. Now then, let's just extremely deal with the two things that came from their world. The first thing they make is about short-term capital flow out of Panama. I think the first thing I want to point out is that all of our reasons and stability largely to be averages. But secondly, the incentives to maintain your operations in Panama still exist with its canals and developed financial sector, which is the reason why it's ultimately why this capital flight stands. Third of all, by the way, even if this is true, this is only the short-term harm we have talked about in this debate, which is the reason why we are more than happy to just prioritize long-term harm that longer benefit that exists in our side of the house. Last step in terms of stability. The first thing I want to claim is to explain why response to crisis is more important than the number of crises that exist, that they say exist more in our world. Four-way mechanisms. Firstly, because some economic crises are inevitable, even in the strongest economies, this means the harms of inability to respond to them is certain to manifest in in some instances. In contrast, currency inflating out of control is speculative. It isn't a force of nature that has to happen in our scientific house. And our strategically observed that their claim was about inflation happening, but they automatically assume that there's going to be a hyperinflation in our world, but all of their arguments only stand in the most extreme spectrum, meaning that their argument is speculative. Secondly, our analysis in response to crisis is logically prior to the harms of currency volatility. If we are able to promptly and effectively respond in time, even in inflation, we can just nip it in the bud. Thirdly, volatility risk is uncomparative. Opposition needs to recognize the risk that they allow in their world, the risk of over-reliance on the service industry, the risk of the Federal Reserve's policy causing a crisis in Panama, the risk of defaulting on debt, and the risk of fiscal policy fueled inflation. If anything, we think the risk is higher in their world. I think the asymmetry on both sides of the house is our ability to respond to the crisis far better than our side of the house, which is the reason why the monetary policy, which we can flexibly use to Panama's situation, was critical to win the stability class as well. We win on the metric as well.
Well, that's really for a speech, not called George Austin. Did you really like it?
We hear a lot about diversity, but we don't hear what it actually looks like. Tourism, 8%, Panama Canal, 6%, banking, 12%, and exports, 11%. The rest is miscellaneous. What I'm trying to say is, they say diversity has a pretty big push, but we don't actually hear why it's not already diverse enough. It's not like Saudi, where it's only oil. We have other things. It's just mainly service-based. We're playing to our strengths, never being paratroopers. Two key things here. Firstly on the framework, and second on two key clashes. Firstly on economic growth, and second on stability and economic crisis. So let's start with the framework then. Why is the model so extremely problematic? 5 reasons. 1, they tell you about a fluctuating peg. Does anybody in this room know how problematic a fluctuating peg is? You know how much capital flight is there when you have a fluctuating peg? It's like saying, this economy is not working, so we're going to do this over 5 years, and then we'll get to a stage where we're good. In those 5 years, every investor is running because they know the current system is not working. Second, we tell you very clearly that Panama lacks the expertise to be able to do this. They have no track record compared to the US, which is the best monetary policy maker in the world. And 3, we tell you corruption is top down. We tell you self-interest is their main priority. And they bring up checks and balances, but we tell you these external checks and balances are not good enough because it's top down. The way they counter this is, 4, they tell you corporations and all these people. Do you know what? The problem is that these corporations also prioritize self-interest. And they tell you, hey, even though they're prioritizing self-interest, they care about the economy because that also benefits their self-interest. Let me tell you something. The thing is, an economy could be falling. Everybody could be falling. But some people can benefit from it. We've seen it everywhere. And these corporates and these corrupt people, top down, will benefit, whether or not the poor people suffer or not. They don't care about this. What they care about is their self-interest. Are you going to bring up corporates and JP Morgan and show why they care about the average person when we very clearly tell you they can benefit even though the economy is failing? Because when they print money, they can use this to their advantage. They can be very strategic in how they invest. They can use currency rates and be able to use that to solve the Panamanian currency and benefit from it. This is not a good check and balance to have. Moving on to the key clashes, but before that, I'll take a point.
How will a JP Morgan operating in a Panama economy be able to benefit from hyperinflation, which causes a crisis that means that your life saving doesn't mean anything at all?
I very clearly told you that what they can do is they can take advantage of the interest rates. Knowing that the economy is going to collapse, they can very clearly sell all of their Panamanian currency and use that to their advantage because they're saying, hey, we'll have trust. It means the Canadian currency will be at a certain point and they can start selling all of it and benefit from that. I think that's pretty interesting. Two flashes then. Firstly on economic growth, let me flesh that out. What do we hear from them? They tell you that economic growth is better on their side because high rates of USD hurts the sectors. A few responses to that. One, we tell you about the nature of Panama and its economy. We tell you it's service-based and we see no issue with it. We tell you that it's diverse enough and we also tell you that we're playing to our strengths and we see nothing wrong with that. But two, we tell you that devaluing actually hurts these main sectors. So what they're trying to say is, hey, this is what we're naturally very good at, but let's hurt that and let's improve our these weaker things that never had the potential to grow. We tell you that this is not good enough in the first place. But three, we tell you even if you assume that the manufacturing can grow, the investor confidence we have is significantly more important than anything they can bring up, which they lack with the new currency. But also four, we tell you that USD gives you such good leverage. When you have that high rate, when you deal with other countries, it actually helps you because you're the one growing. They present this problem of the USD growing as problematic to Panama. But guess who has the currency that is growing? Panama, because that's the currency we deal in. So all of our reserves are in the USD and we trade with other countries where our rate is higher. It means we're benefiting day by day. Take it from a Tanzanian. My currency from the day I was born was 1,000 shillings to $1. Now it's 2,800. You could have $1 and you could have doubled in Tanzania. Panama is benefiting and that is clearly very true. But two, we tell you about the idea of exports and imports. Again, I repeat to you, we would rather play to our strengths and we tell you that our strengths are diverse enough in nature. We tell you we have tourism, we tell you we have Panama, and we tell you banking. Just because we're service concentrated doesn't mean that we're not diverse. But two, we tell you that it's very unlikely for Panama to have a strong manufacturing base. This is for three reasons. One is the low GDP. Yes, I brought up a POI. It's an unfair comparison to be doing it with Singapore, which has such a strong GDP. They tell you it's not an example game, but this is the structural reason we're giving you. Their GDP is not strong enough because of the population size. But two, we tell you we don't even have the natural resources. You literally lack the ability. In terms of growth, three, we tell you that there's no wage stagnation. They tell you, hey, with the USD, it's only the top benefiting. We tell you that the workers also get paid in USD, meaning that there's no wage stagnation. What they can buy or what they get is pretty symmetric. What do we tell you then on economic growth? We face no refutation to this. We tell you that the USD actually helps them in terms of investor confidence, but it also gives them a high rate of leverage and it allows easier and cheaper trade. To this, we receive absolutely nothing. We also bring up that a new currency is particularly bad for three reasons. We tell you that it doesn't have the stability because of how small it is. Check South American currencies for reference. Two, we tell you that there's no public trust or investor trust. And three, we tell you we have costlier trades with the higher exchange rates. On main then, even if you're diversifying but hurting the economy, who's winning? But two, we tell you it's totally fine to not be diversifying. Even take the extreme examples of Saudi who are so reliant on oil, they're doing totally fine. And if we have an economy like that, we're totally fine with that, and we don't see the problem with it in the worst case. Second flash then, which is a bit smaller, but on monetary policy. Their claim is on crisis, and they tell you US and Panama have different interests. Four key responses. One, we tell you the monetary policy set by US is going to affect both US and Panama symmetrically. It means that they're not acting out of the best interest of Panama, but acting in their best interest, it's helping Panama. But two, crisis comes in two ways. One, it's a global crisis and it affects both of them. Then the reaction, which is lowering money, is the same. It's not like fiscal policy where you have to be significantly flexible. If you're in a crisis, you can just lower interest rates and it's going to work symmetrically. But three, that all tells you that US don't have to care about Panama for us to be doing well. But four, we tell you even when it's different, fiscal policy is better. Lastly then, on fiscal policy and why it's better, that's the question we tell you, and why it better deals with the economic crisis. One, they tell you fiscal policy is slow, but it's fast. In times of crisis, Panama mobilize $15 million like that. Two, just look at historical precedent. With COVID-19, we dealt with it so well, Panama was one of the best countries in dealing with it. But three, scale of impact, when corruption is that bad, then we would much rather have fiscal policy than monetary policy in our hands, which cannot be accounted. Never be proud of you.
Well, let us go for a bad speech.
Side proposition would find a pearl in the ocean and throw it back in the hopes of a diamond. We are one of two high-income countries in the Latin America region, second only to Mexico, and guess what currency both of those countries use? The US dollar. They claim long-term benefits on their side of the house, and they are happy to concede the short-term. But the problem is, when you have so many short-term benefits that it prevents the long-term to happen, which is what is happening with the local currency. We have three main issues in this debate. We have one, who does monetary policy better, the US Fed or Panama? We have two, economic growth and stability, and then three, in the event of a crisis. Let's start with monetary policy, yeah? So we very clearly told you on our side that we have top-down corruption, from the president all the way down. They told you the 2/3 of private. The problem is when corruption is so top-down, especially in developing countries like Panama, Tanzania, etc., the parliament is majorly controlled by the president. So their checks and balances are infected in that 2/3 of power. Another thing we talk about is external checks and balances like the IMF. So if you're going to allow the IMF to control your central bank, then all your claims on crisis become symmetric, because now you don't control your monetary policy either, the IMF controls it. So either or, pick and choose. And we gave you two structural reasons as to why monetary policy, giving it to Panamanians, is significantly worse than having them have fiscal policy, which have not really been dealt with. We talk about monetary policy is so much harder to see and be accounted for. Because of the fact that you can audit a budget and you can't audit an interest rate. Because you can track the budget and see, oh, this money did not go where it's supposed to. I can clearly see, oh, there's corruption here. How am I able to see, oh, this interest rate isn't what it's supposed to be. Oh, this value isn't what it's supposed to be. It's so much difficult, which is why it incentivizes corruption, because it's so easy to hide. And secondly, even if that's not true, scale of impact is significantly worse if you mess up monetary policy, which I think they concede to. If you mess up monetary policy, it's a big deal. If you mess up fiscal policy, okay, $1,000 here and there. You mess up monetary policy, you've messed up the economy for structurally for the next 4 years, next 100 years actually. The second thing on growth and stability, okay, we told you two things in our first argument with growth and stability. We talked about the low inflation rates, which I think they agree with, 0.7, which is ridiculously low in all of Latin America. And secondly, we talked about the issue of investor confidence in FDI. We very clearly told you how we have capital flight in our world, and I think they conceded, and in the short term, capital flight will occur. And the problem is, you need that capital to diversify the economy as they really want, and that's something they've not really dealt with. So in order to diversify, I don't know where their money is coming from. It's just gonna, maybe they'll print it, and if they do print it, it's gonna lead to hyperinflation again. So double bind here. Let me just deal with this export-based thing. First of all, we're not export-based. We don't need to be export-based. They say we don't need raw materials to be export-based. We gave you the natural resources thing. If we truly don't need raw materials and we're going to import all those things, then again our import costs go really high because we don't have the USD to trade in. So that's again a contradiction on their side. So we don't want devaluation because a strong currency definitely helps. I talk about we don't have growth. So even if I take them at their best, where I say, okay, we have wage stagnation, the growth doesn't happen, because of the fact that inflation is so low, at worst, because inflation and wage stagnation are equal, purchasing power is important, working class stays the same. That is our worst case scenario. On their case, hyperinflation is a big risk on their side, which is definitely better for the working class in our side. Now moving on to a major thing that we've talked about is crisis. So first of all, we've talked about the crisis affects both of them. I think this is pretty clear because you just raise or lower interest rates, and because we have the same currency and our economies are linked, it's pretty clear. The more important thing is unique to Panama, right? So three things here. First of all, we need investor confidence to get cheap loans. Without investor confidence, and I've already showed you we lose investor confidence, we get expensive loans and we get debt traps. Either we don't get the loans because they refuse to give it to us, or we get really expensive loans and suffer debt crises, like they claim we have on those islands, and we actually flip this. Secondly is we prevent the ability to hyperinflate. Like Zimbabwe did. When they face a crisis, they panic print, and they face hyperinflation and just mess up the economy completely. And then three, fiscal policy is significantly fast. It's pretty clear in this transitional period they're likely to cause an economic crisis in their attempt to mitigate a hypothetical future crisis, and that is why we've clearly won.
How to close the way based on all the proposition of the and when you're ready, can be sure.
First clash, stability. I want to know two things at the top. One, the central bank will be done well, and two, the currency will be stable. One, how do we prove the central bank will be done well? There was a bunch of mechanisms from my deputy. We proved through our model that we mitigate a lot of this risk of things like corruptibility by, only allowing for a 2/3 majority in parliament to create changes in board members. We talked about how other institutions like the central bank, other institutions like the IMF will hold the central bank accountable. Obviously IMF has lent money to the central bank. There's incentive there. It also came with fear of capacity to get loans in the future, which means Panama also has incentive to self-regulate. We also talked about how corrupt governments just aren't stupid. Not only will voters punish them, and Panama's race is inherently very, very close in who gets to. The fragmented parliament also means there's rotation of power between parties, etc. All of this proves central bank will be done fairly well. Secondly, we also proved that the currency will be somewhat stable. For their harms to materialize, obviously their burden is to prove rapid, uncontrollable devaluation. We concede devaluation to a certain extent anyway. We preempted the rapid and extreme nature of this from a frame by arguing that foreign reserves, for example, can be used to buy Balboa with USD. We also talked about the fairly good track record as they concede that Panama has a financial management. And we talked about the nature of Panama and its importance in the global economy, meaning international actors have incentive to help them. But even if they were to have been able to prove hyperinflation, we proved that Panama, like every policy change, obviously has these risks. They can't just claim speculative risks and then claim de-dollarization is not worth it. There are other existing risks you must weigh this claim against. For example, the risk of an economy that relies on one canal in a single sector industry, or a monetary crisis that Panama has no tools to resolve, or defaulting on debt. Compared to these risks from hyperinflation, the weighing is, one, these harms have materialized before and are certain to materialize again, as some form of economic crisis always happens once a decade. Second, these harms last longer, as these are structural risks, as opposed to the short-term paranoid selling of Balboas that eventually obviously stabilize. And thirdly, these harms can't be fixed, at least not without independent monetary policy, as opposed to inflation, which can be moderated. At worst, the response to the crisis is even more important than stability. There were three weighing mechanisms from Natsuki to prove this to you. We proved response to crisis, despite what they said from our first speak, by proving that U.S. monetary policy, even if it is done, it doesn't align with what Panama needs. For example, the U.S. prioritizing stability over growth and unemployment, or U.S. policy being tailored to obviously U.S. fiscal policy, which is different from Panama. Furthermore, there was just no response to two mechanisms from our first layer under this argument that proves that fiscal policy actually leads to, for example, the accumulation of debt or the politicization of fiscal policy leading to bad fiscal policy. Second question on growth. Firstly, and most importantly, this clash is actually fairly important because despite what they claim, Panama is not doing fine and won't be fine in the long term. The real unemployment rate in Panama is 30%. Alternatives to the canal are being formed. The majority of its economy is based on an untaxable service sector that is informal. We also talked about how when we diversify, Panama can become more self-sufficient, which saves it against, for example, potential U.S. tariffs, where it prevents economic shocks that impact one industry, which drags down the entire economy. It also leads to more diverse job options that allows for example, the less educated and more impoverished individuals to actually get a job, which is a big problem in the unequal Panama industry. And we proved that manufacturing industries has more potentiality for growth, while service industries cannot innovate for growth. Crucially, we would argue that this dispels their silver bullet on empirical fact. With that out of the way, we would also argue that it's actually fairly easy to diversify, and it's possible to diversify because of Panama. Like, they claim the lack of natural resources prevents Panama from diversifying. But obviously, manufacturing doesn't necessitate you create the natural resources in the country. You import resources, you make the product, and then you export the product. The low GDP response also doesn't work, because historically Singapore was poor before they were able to create a manufacturing industry. We would argue that it is possible to diversify. This is an important impact, and we win the debate here. Proud to propose.
For a great round. I encourage you to shake hands and